In the frozen halls of Ironridge Fortress, where silence is survival and questions are treason, a servant Omega named Alara Voss is about to shatter every rule that keeps her breathing. When her young son points to a royal portrait and declares the painted prince has his eyes, the throne room erupts. The Alpha King demands answers. The court whispers execution. But Alara speaks 6 words that will ignite a war, resurrect a dead heir, and prove that the most dangerous weapon in any kingdom isn't a blade, it's the truth. Will you stay until the final revelation? Like, comment your city, and let's begin. The cold in Ironridge Fortress wasn't just weather, it was a living thing. It crept through stone corridors like a predator, settled into bones, turned breath into frost. Alara Voss had learned to move through it the way shadows moved, silent, unnoticed, essential, but invisible. She was 26 years old and had been a servant in the fortress for 3 years. Before that, she'd lived in the frontier wilderness, surviving on instinct and whatever mercy the forest offered. She was Omega class, which meant she ranked below soldiers, below merchants, below anyone with a bloodline worth mentioning. In the hierarchy of Ironridge, she was a ghost who happened to scrub floors. Her son, Heir, was 4 years old. He had dark hair that fell across eyes the color of winter storms, pale gray with flecks of silver that caught the light. He was too clever for his own safety, too curious for a child born to silence. Alara had taught him early, don't ask questions, don't draw attention. Survive first, live second. But children don't always obey survival. It was the 3rd week of the ice moon when everything collapsed. Alara had been assigned to the Hall of Valor, a cavernous chamber lined with portraits of Ironridge's royal bloodline. Generations of thorns stared down from gilded frames, warriors, kings, queens who'd bled and conquered. The hall smelled of old wood and colder stone. Torches flickered against walls that had witnessed centuries of power. Heir had been sick the previous night, a fever that scared her silent, so she'd brought him along rather than leave him alone in their cramped servants' quarters. He sat quietly on the floor near the eastern wall, playing with a carved wooden wolf she'd traded 2 weeks' rations to buy. Alara worked methodically, dust the frames, polish the brass nameplates. Don't look too long at the faces, don't wonder about the lives behind the paint. Just clean and move on. She was halfway down the hall when Heir stood up. "Mama." His voice was soft, but in the vast silence of the hall, it echoed. Alara glanced over her shoulder. "Stay quiet, little wolf. We're almost done." Heir walked toward her, his small boots clicking against stone. He stopped in front of a portrait she'd just finished cleaning, a massive frame depicting a young man in battle armor. The painted prince stood against a background of mountain peaks, one hand on the hilt of a longsword, the other holding a wolf's head sigil. The nameplate read, Prince Darian Thorn, lost in the Highland Campaign, honored in memory. Heir tilted his head, studying the portrait with the focused intensity only children possess. "Mama?" he said again, louder this time. "That man has my eyes!" Alara's blood turned to ice. She crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, grabbing Heir's shoulder. "Don't say that." "But look!" Heir pointed upward, unafraid. "Same eyes, like mine." Alara followed his gaze to the portrait. The prince's face was angular, hardened by war, framed by dark hair. But the eyes... Her breath caught. They were the same. Pale gray. Storm-lit. Unmistakable. The polishing cloth slipped from her hand and hit the floor. The man in the portrait wasn't just a painted prince. He was the stranger she'd found bleeding in the forest 5 years ago. The warrior she'd nursed back from the edge of death. The man who'd lived with her for 6 months in a hunter's cabin on the frontier, who'd chopped wood and mended fences and made her laugh for the first time since she'd lost her family. The man who'd told her his name was Darian, just Darian, and claimed he had no memory of anything before waking in her care. The man who'd held her on winter nights and promised her nothing, because promises were dangerous. The man who'd left one morning without a word, disappearing into the wilderness like smoke. The father of her child. Alara's knees threatened to buckle. She pressed one hand against the wall for balance, the other still gripping Heir's shoulder. "Mama?" Heir's voice was uncertain now. "Are you sick?" Before she could answer, the hall's massive double doors swung open. Boots struck stone in perfect unison. A A column of royal guards entered first, their armor gleaming even in the dim torchlight. Behind them came advisors in formal robes, their expressions carved from granite. And at the center of the procession, radiating authority like heat from a forge, strode Alpha King Ragnar Thorn. He was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with a face that had commanded armies and crushed rebellions. His eyes were the color of iron, sharp enough to cut. He wore no crown in the Hall of Valor. He didn't need one. Power followed him like a shadow. The entire procession stopped. Ragnar's gaze swept the hall and landed on Alara like a hammer. She dropped into a bow immediately, pulling Kael down with her. "Your Majesty." Silence stretched. Alara kept her eyes on the floor, heart hammering against her ribs. Kings didn't visit the Hall of Valor unannounced. Kings didn't notice servants unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. "Stand!" Ragnar's voice wasn't loud, but it filled the space like thunder rolling through a valley. Alara rose slowly, keeping Kael behind her. The king studied her for a long moment. His expression was unreadable, carved stone hiding calculation. "You're the Omega who cleans this hall?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "What's your name?" "Alara Voss, Your Majesty." Ragnar's gaze shifted to Kael, who was peeking around his mother's skirt. The king's eyes narrowed fractionally. Then he looked up at the portrait Kael had been examining. Something flickered across Ragnar's face. Recognition, maybe. Or suspicion. One of the advisors, a thin man with a beard like frost, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, if the servant has disturbed you, we can have her removed." Ragnar raised one hand. The advisor fell silent immediately. The king descended the steps slowly, deliberately, until he stood 3 paces from Alara. This close, he was overwhelming. Presence, power, danger, all wrapped in controlled stillness. "How old is the boy?" Alara's throat went dry. 4 years, Your Majesty." "And his father?" Every instinct screamed at her to lie, to invent a dead soldier, a merchant who'd abandoned her, anyone except the truth. But Kael was already looking up at the portrait again, and Ragnar was already following his gaze. Alara made a choice that defied every survival instinct she'd ever honed. She lifted her chin and met the Alpha King's eyes. "Why?" she said quietly. "Is my child's father in that portrait?" The hall erupted. Advisors gasped. Guards shifted, hands moving toward weapons. The thin-bearded advisor sputtered, "Your Majesty, this Omega speaks treason." Ragnar raised his hand again, and the chaos stopped like someone had cut the strings. The king stared at Alara. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those iron eyes, burned with something she couldn't name. "Say that again." Alara's hands trembled, but her voice held steady. "The man in that portrait lived with me for 6 months, 5 years ago. He told me his name was Darian. He had no memory of where he came from, and when he left," her voice cracked, just slightly. "When he left, I didn't know I was carrying his child." Dead silence. Ragnar turned to the portrait, stared at it for 10 heartbeats. Then he looked back at Kael. The resemblance was impossible to deny. The eyes, the sharp angle of the jaw, even at 4 years old. The way the boy stood, straight-backed, fearless, despite the room full of armed men. Thorn bloodline, undeniable as sunrise. The king's voice dropped to something quiet and deadly. "Are you claiming that my son, the prince lost in the Highland campaign 5 years ago, fathered your child?" "I'm claiming," Alara said, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs, "that the man I knew as Darian, who bled in my arms and lived in my cabin and disappeared without explanation, is the same man in that portrait. And yes, he's Kael's father." An advisor stepped forward, fury written across his face. "Your Majesty, this is absurd. Prince Darian died in the Highlands. His unit was slaughtered. This Omega seeks attention, or coin, or his body was never recovered," Ragnar said quietly. The advisor froze. Ragnar turned to face the room. "Prince Darian Thorn vanished during the Highland campaign. His unit was ambushed. We found 16 bodies. We never found his." His voice hardened. "We assumed death because the alternative was worse, that he'd been captured, tortured, or turned." He looked back at Alara. "But if he survived wounded with no memory, The king's jaw tightened. If he survived and wandered into frontier territory, then he could have lived, Ilara finished quietly, as a man with no past. Ragnar studied her for a long, terrible moment. Then he crouched down, bringing himself to Kael's eye level. Boy, what's your name? Kael didn't flinch. Kael Voss, sir. Do you know who I am? You're the king. That's right, Ragnar's voice gentled, just slightly. And do you know whose portrait that is? Kael nodded solemnly. The prince, Mama's friend. Something that might have been pain crossed Ragnar's face. He stood slowly, his gaze never leaving the child. High Commander Torin, he said without turning. A massive warrior stepped forward from the guard column, scarred, grizzled, built like a siege engine. Your Majesty, take the Omega and her son to the East Wing. Give them quarters, post guards, for their protection, not imprisonment. Torin saluted. At once. The advisors exploded into protest. Your Majesty, you can't possibly... I can, Ragnar said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. And I will. This Omega has made a claim that, if true, changes everything. He turned to face the assembled council. If my son survived, if he's alive somewhere, then I will find him. And if this child truly carries Thorn blood... He looked at Kael again, and this time there was no mistaking the emotion in his eyes. Hope. Terrible, dangerous hope. Then my grandson will be acknowledged. The room fell silent. Ilara's knees finally buckled. Commander Torin caught her before she hit the floor, his grip surprisingly gentle for such a brutal-looking man. Easy, Omega, he murmured. You just survived something that should have killed you. Ilara looked up at him, dazed. What happens now? Torin's scarred face was unreadable. Now? The king investigates, and you pray your story holds. The East Wing quarters were a shock. Ilara had lived in servant chambers, cramped cells barely large enough for a cot and a trunk. The rooms Torin escorted them to were larger than the entire cabin she'd once shared with Darien. Stone walls were softened by tapestries. A fire roared in a massive hearth. Two beds, not cots, stood on opposite sides of the room, piled with furs and thick blankets. A table held fresh bread, cheese, and dried fruit. Kael ran straight to the fire, spreading his hands toward the warmth. Ilara stood frozen in the doorway. It's not a trap, Torin said from behind her. The king meant what he said. You're under protection. Protection from what? Torin's expression darkened. From everyone who'll want you dead by morning. Ilara's blood chilled. I told the truth. I know, that's what makes you dangerous. Torin gestured to the room. Stay inside tonight. Don't open the door for anyone except me or the king. Understood? Ilara nodded. Torin turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, the boy has his eyes. I served with Prince Darien. I'd know those eyes anywhere. He left before Ilara could respond. The door closed. A bolt slid home from the outside. Not a lock, but a guard taking position. Ilara sank onto the nearest bed, her entire body shaking. Kael climbed up beside her, tucking himself against her side. Mama? Are we in trouble? Ilara wrapped her arms around him, breathing in the scent of his hair, wood smoke and soap, and something uniquely him. No, little wolf, she whispered. We're not in trouble. We're in something far more dangerous, she thought, but didn't say. We're in the truth. Sleep didn't come. Ilara lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Kael slept curled against her side. The fire burned low, casting shifting shadows across stone walls. Her mind raced through memories she'd tried to bury. 5 years ago. The frontier. Late autumn, when the forest was bleeding into winter. She'd been checking trap lines when she'd heard the sound. Something between a groan and a growl, coming from a ravine half a mile north of her cabin. She should have run. Predators made noises like that. Injured predators were twice as dangerous. But something pulled her forward. She'd found him at the bottom of the ravine, half buried in dead leaves and mud. He was massive, taller than any man she'd seen, built like he'd been carved from oak. Armor, shattered, sword, broken, body, bleeding from a dozen wounds. He should have been dead. But when she touched his throat, checking for a pulse, his eyes had snapped open, storm gray, feral, focused on her with an intensity that froze her in place. "Don't," he'd rasped. "Don't run." As if she could have outrun him, even wounded. She'd made another impossible choice that day. She'd helped him to his feet, half carried, half dragged him back to her cabin, and somehow gotten him inside before he collapsed again. The first week, she thought he'd die. Infection set in. Fever burned through him. He thrashed and muttered in languages she didn't recognize, names she couldn't place. But he didn't die. By the second week, he was sitting up. By the third, he was walking. By the end of the first month, he was chopping firewood and mending the cabin's damaged roof. He remembered nothing, not his name, not where he'd come from, not how he'd ended up bleeding in a ravine. The only thing he'd been certain of was the name that felt right when she'd asked what to call him. Darian. He'd stayed through winter, helped her survive the brutal cold, the food shortages, the isolation that drove most frontier settlers mad. And somewhere between survival and spring, she'd fallen in love. He'd never said he loved her back, but the way he looked at her, the way he held her when the nights were coldest, the way he smiled when she made him laugh, it had felt real. Until the morning she'd woken to find him gone. No note, no goodbye. Just empty space where he'd been. She'd searched for days. Found nothing. Eventually accepted that whatever past he'd been running from had finally caught up to him. She'd discovered she was pregnant 2 months later. Now, lying in a royal guest room with guards outside the door and a king investigating her story, Alara understood something she'd been too heartbroken to see back then. He hadn't run from her. He'd remembered. Somewhere between winter and spring, Darian's memory had returned. And when it did, he'd realized who he was. A prince, an heir, a man with responsibilities that didn't include a frontier Omega and the life they'd accidentally built. So he'd left, disappeared, gone back to whatever world he belonged to, except he never made it back. Alara closed her eyes, feeling tears slip down her temples. "Where are you?" she thought into the darkness. "Are you even alive?" Somewhere in the fortress, an Alpha King was asking the same question. And if the answer was yes, if Darian Thorne had somehow survived 5 years beyond that ravine, then everything Alara had built on silence and survival was about to shatter. She pulled Kale closer and waited for dawn. Morning came with a knock that rattled the door in its frame. Alara jolted awake, heart hammering. Kael stirred beside her, but didn't wake. "Omega Voss," Commander Torin's voice gruff but not threatening. "The king requests your presence, now." Alara slid out of bed, quickly braiding her hair and smoothing her servant's dress, the same rough wool she'd worn yesterday, now wrinkled from sleep. She kissed Kael's forehead. "Stay here, little wolf. I'll be back soon." Kael mumbled something and burrowed deeper into the furs. Alara opened the door. Torin stood in the corridor, flanked by 2 guards. His expression was unreadable. "Is this about the investigation?" Alara asked. "It's about everything." Torin gestured down the hall. "Walk." They moved through corridors Alara had only ever cleaned, never walked through as anything other than invisible labor. Servants pressed themselves against walls as the group passed, their eyes wide with speculation. Whispers followed like smoke. The Omega who claimed, "Impossible, the prince is dead." But the child's eyes. Alara kept her gaze forward and her chin up. They entered the council chamber, a vast circular room with a table carved from a single massive tree, polished to a mirror shine. Maps covered the walls. Weapons hung above the hearth, ancestral blades, each one representing a generation of Thorn rule. Alpha King Ragnar stood at the head of the table, flanked by advisors. He looked like he hadn't slept. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw tight with tension. But when he saw Alara, something in his expression shifted. "Leave us," he said to the advisors. Protests erupted immediately. "Your Majesty, protocol, leave!" The room emptied. Even Torin withdrew, though he stationed himself just outside the door. Ragnar gestured to a chair. "Sit." Alara sat, hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. The king remained standing. "I've spent the night reviewing records, interrogating the soldiers who survived the Highland campaign, tracking supply routes, troop movements, everything we documented from that disaster." He paused, jaw working. "Prince Darian's unit was ambushed in the Black Ridge Pass. 16 men died. We recovered their bodies. My son's body was never found, but the area was... He exhaled slowly. Ravines, cliffs, rivers that run fast and deep. We assumed he'd been swept away or fallen where we couldn't recover him. Alara stayed silent, letting him speak. But one of the survivors, a scout who'd been separated from the main unit, reported something I'd forgotten until last night. Ragnar's eyes locked onto hers. He said he saw someone moving in the forest below the pass, wounded, alone. He tried to pursue but lost the trail in a storm. Alara's breath caught. How far from where I found him? 20 miles. Through brutal terrain, Ragnar's voice roughened. If a man was wounded, delirious, with no memory, he could have wandered that distance before collapsing. Silence stretched between them. I need to know everything, Ragnar said quietly. Every detail. What he looked like, how he spoke, what he remembered. Everything. Alara nodded, and then, in a voice steadier than she felt, she told the Alpha King everything. She described finding Darien in the ravine, the injuries, blade wounds across his ribs, a gash on his temple that could have caused memory loss, the fever that nearly killed him, the slow, painful recovery. She described the months that followed, how he'd helped her survive winter, how he'd been quiet but kind, fierce but gentle, how he'd worked with his hands like someone who understood labor, but moved like someone trained for war. Did he ever remember anything? Ragnar asked, his voice tight. Fragments. Nightmares, mostly. He'd wake up shouting orders, battle commands, names I didn't recognize. Alara hesitated. Once he woke up calling for someone named Ragnar. The king's face went absolutely still. He said it like a prayer, Alara continued softly. Like he was trying to reach someone he'd lost. Ragnar turned away, gripping the edge of the table. His shoulders rose and fell, with a breath that sounded like it cost him everything. When he turned back, his eyes were wet. My son is alive, he said, voice shaking with controlled fury and desperate hope. He survived that ambush. He survived 5 years of something, and I'm going to find him. How? Alara asked. If he left my cabin 5 years ago, then someone found him, captured him, held him. Ragnar's expression turned to stone. And I will burn through every territory, every stronghold, every God's damned mountain between here and the border until I bring my son home. He crossed to Alara, standing close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. You saved his life once, Ragnar said quietly. You gave me hope that my bloodline didn't end in that pass. For that, you have my protection. No one in this fortress will touch you or your son. Do you understand? Alara nodded. But if you're lying... Ragnar's voice dropped to something deadly. If this is some scheme for power or coin, I want nothing from you, Alara interrupted, her own voice hardening. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for Kyle to recognize a portrait or for the truth to come out. All I want is to survive. That's all I've ever wanted. Ragnar studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded, something like respect flickering in his eyes. Then survive, Omega Voss. Because when I find my son... He looked toward the maps on the wall, his expression turning predatory. This kingdom is going to change, and you're at the center of it. He turned and strode from the room, leaving Alara alone in a chamber built for kings. She sat there shaking, staring at the weapons on the walls. Somewhere beyond these stone halls, Darien Thorn was alive, and the entire kingdom was about to go to war to bring him home. The fortress erupted before sunset. Alara returned to her quarters to find Kyle eating breakfast, thick porridge with honey, fresh cream, berries she'd never been able to afford. A servant woman stood by the fire, young and nervous, wringing her hands. The king sent food, the woman said quickly, for the boy, and for you. Alara nodded, too exhausted to question it. Thank you. The woman hesitated at the door. Is it true? What they're saying? What are they saying? That you're the prince's... She trailed off, eyes wide. That your son is royal blood? Alara met her gaze steadily. I told the truth. That's all. The woman fled. Kyle looked up from his bowl, honey on his chin. Everyone's scared of us now. Not scared, Alara said, sitting beside him. Confused. What's the difference? Alara wiped his face with her sleeve. Scared people run. Confused people ask questions. And questions. She thought of Ragnar's face in the council chamber, that terrible hope. Questions change things. A knock rattled the door. Commander Torin entered without waiting for permission, his expression grim. The council's convened. They want you present. Alara's stomach dropped. Why? Because half of them think you're lying, and the other half think you're telling the truth. Either way, you're about to be torn apart. Torin's scarred face softened fractionally. The king will protect you, but you need to hold your ground. Alara looked at Kael, who'd gone very still. I'll post guards here, Torin said. The boy stays. You come now. Alara kissed Kael's forehead. Be brave, little wolf. You too, Mama. The council chamber was a battlefield disguised as a meeting hall. 20 advisors sat around the massive table, their faces ranging from skeptical to hostile. Alara recognized the thin-bearded man from yesterday, Lord Castor, the king's chief advisor. His expression was carved from contempt. Ragnar sat at the head of the table, radiating controlled fury. He gestured to an empty chair beside him. Omega Voss, sit. Alara crossed the room, feeling every eye track her movement. She sat, back straight, hands folded. Lord Castor stood immediately. Your Majesty, with respect, this farce has gone far enough. This Omega's claims are unverified, impossible to prove, and frankly insulting to... Insulting to whom? Ragnar's voice cut like a blade. To you, Castor? Or to my son's memory? Castor's face flushed. Your Majesty, we all mourn Prince Darien, but allowing a servant to claim royal connection based on a child's observation, the child has his eyes, Ragnar said flatly. You saw them. We all did. Eyes can be similar without indicating blood relation, another advisor argued, a heavy-set woman named Lady Marin. Coincidence doesn't prove legitimacy. Then what would? Ragnar leaned forward. What proof would satisfy this council? Silence. Alara felt rage building in her chest, quiet, cold, the kind that came from years of being dismissed and overlooked. You want proof? She said quietly. Every head turned. Alara stood, meeting each advisor's gaze in turn. The man I knew had a scar across his ribs, 3 parallel lines like claw marks. He said he didn't remember how he got it, but it was old, healed badly. Ragnar's expression shifted. Darien had that scar from a training accident when he was 16. Murmurs rippled through the council. He had a habit, Alara continued, her voice gaining strength, of rolling his left shoulder when he was thinking. Like it bothered him, an old injury that never healed right. Dislocated in battle, Ragnar said, his voice rough. 3 years before the Highland campaign. Lady Marin frowned. Those details could have been learned from soldiers who served with the prince. Could they? Alara turned to her. Could they tell you that he hated the taste of pine tea but drank it anyway because it helped him sleep? That he carved animals from wood when his hands needed something to do? That he had nightmares about drowning, and he'd wake up gasping like he'd been pulled from water? Ragnar's face had gone pale. Could a soldier tell you, Alara pressed, her voice shaking now, that he cried once, only once, when he thought I was asleep? That he said he felt like he'd lost something but couldn't remember what it was? Dead silence filled the chamber. Ragnar stood slowly. The nightmares. He had them as a child, after his mother drowned in the winter floods. His voice cracked. He never spoke of it. Not to anyone. Castor tried again. Your Majesty, even if this woman knew Prince Darien, that doesn't prove the child is his. Then test the blood, a new voice said. Everyone turned. An elderly woman entered the chamber, stooped, white-haired, leaning on a gnarled staff. Her eyes were milky with age, but sharp as broken glass. She wore robes that marked her as the fortress's senior healer. Matron Hilda, Ragnar said, respect in his tone. You have insight? I have common sense, Hilda rasped, shuffling forward. Which seems in short supply. She pointed her staff at Kael's empty chair. Bring the boy here. Let me examine him. Examine him how? Castor demanded. Blood calls to blood, Hilda said. Thorn bloodline carries markers, scent, bone structure, even the way the child moves. She fixed Ragnar with a knowing stare. You felt it yesterday, didn't you? When you looked at him? Ragnar didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. Bring him, Hilda repeated. Torin was dispatched. 10 agonizing minutes passed in tense silence. When Kael entered, flanked by guards, he looked impossibly small, but he walked straight to Alara without hesitation, climbing into her lap. Hilda approached slowly, studying the boy with eyes that missed nothing. Stand, child. Kael obeyed, stepping away from Alara. He met Hilda's gaze without flinching. The old healer circled him slowly, studied his eyes, his hands, the set of his shoulders. Then she did something unexpected. She drew a small blade from her robes. Alara lunged forward. Don't. Peace, Omega. Hilda's voice was firm, but not cruel. She pricked Kael's finger, catching a single drop of blood on a white cloth. She held it to the light, closed her eyes, breathed deeply. When she opened them again, she looked at Ragnar. This child carries thorn blood. I'd stake my life on it. The room exploded. Advisors shouted over each other. Some demanded further proof. Others called for acceptance. Castor looked like he'd swallowed poison. Ragnar raised his hand, and silence crashed down. The healer has spoken, he said, his voice absolute. I recognize Kyle Voss as my grandson. Alara Voss will be elevated to protected status within this court, and his eyes hardened. I will launch a full investigation into my son's disappearance. Your Majesty, Lady Maren said carefully, what kind of investigation? The kind, Ragnar said, that assumes Prince Darien survived, that someone found him, that he's being held or worse, controlled. He stood, towering over the table. If my son is alive, I will find him. If he's dead, I will find who's responsible. Either way. His voice dropped to something deadly. Someone will answer. Castor tried one last time. Your Majesty, the resources required for such an endeavor are mine to spend, Ragnar finished. This council is dismissed. Advisors filed out, their expressions ranging from shock to fury. Alara remained seated, Kael pressed against her side. Ragnar approached them slowly. He crouched down, bringing himself to Kael's level. You're a brave boy, he said quietly. Kael tilted his head. Are you my grandfather? Something that might have been pain crossed Ragnar's face. If your mother speaks truth, and I believe she does, then yes. Does that mean we can stay here? It means, Ragnar said, his voice rough, that you're family. And family doesn't get cast out. He looked at Alara. But it also means you're in danger. There are people in this fortress, in this kingdom, who won't accept this. I know, Alara said quietly. Ragnar stood. Torin will assign permanent guards. You'll move to better quarters tomorrow. And he hesitated. You'll begin learning court protocols. If my son returns and you're to be acknowledged as his, he trailed off, but the implication was clear. Alara's future had just become complicated in ways she couldn't begin to understand. That night, alone in the dark with Kael sleeping beside her, Alara finally let herself shake. She'd survived the council, survived interrogation, even gained the king's recognition. But survival wasn't safety. And somewhere in the shadows of Ironridge Fortress, enemies were already sharpening their knives. 3 days later, the investigation began. Ragnar summoned Torin, 2 trackers, and a scout who'd survived the Highland campaign. They spread maps across the war table, marking locations, troop movements, possible routes. We know Darien's unit was ambushed here, Ragnar said, pointing to Blackridge Pass. Omega Voss found him here. He marked a spot 20 miles south. In frontier territory, he stayed with her through winter, then disappeared in early spring. Where would he go? Torin asked. If his memory returned, why not come home? Maybe he tried, the scout said grimly. Those highlands are crawling with raiders, mercenaries, rogue clans. If he was alone, wounded, trying to cross back into Ironridge territory. He could have been captured, Ragnar finished. His jaw tightened. Or killed. But if he's alive, Torin said slowly, and someone's held him for 5 years, why? Silence stretched. Then Lady Maren, who who'd insisted on attending, spoke quietly. Leverage, a prince is worth more alive than dead. Ransom, political bargaining, or, she hesitated, control. If someone could break him, turn him, my son doesn't break, Ragnar said, but there was doubt in his voice. 5 years is a long time, Your Majesty, Maren said gently. Ragnar's expression hardened. Then we find out. Torin, send scouts into the highlands. Every mercenary camp, every rogue settlement, offer gold for information, and, his voice turned deadly, offer steel for resistance. Torin saluted. It'll be done. But finding information in the highlands was like hunting smoke. The first scouts returned 2 weeks later with nothing. The second wave came back bloodied, reporting that mercenary clans had gone silent, suspiciously silent. They know something, Torin reported to Ragnar in the war room, but they're not talking, even under pressure. Ragnar's expression was stone. Then we apply more pressure. Meanwhile, Alara's life transformed in ways that felt like drowning. She was moved to quarters in the royal wing, rooms with tapestries, servants, furniture that cost more than she'd earned in a lifetime. Tutors arrived daily to teach her court etiquette, formal speech, the intricate dance of noble politics. She hated every second of it. You must curtsy lower for the high lords, her etiquette tutor said, a pinched woman named Septa Maris, and never speak unless addressed directly. I'm not a trained dog, Alara said flatly. Maris's face flushed. You are an Omega elevated beyond your station. If you wish to remain elevated, you will learn— I didn't ask to be elevated, Alara interrupted. I asked to survive. There's a difference. Maris left in a huff. Kael, meanwhile, thrived. He explored the fortress with fearless curiosity, befriending guards and kitchen staff. He asked questions constantly about the fortress's history, about battles, about his father. Alara tried to answer what she could, but the truth was, she didn't know. She didn't know if Darien was alive, didn't know if he'd ever cared for her the way she'd cared for him, didn't know if finding him would heal the wound in her chest or tear it open wider. But the kingdom was turning itself inside out to find answers, and Alara was at the center of the storm. Opposition came swiftly and viciously. Petitions arrived demanding Alara's removal from the fortress. Anonymous threats were slipped under her door, crude drawings of Omegas hanging from gallows, notes warning her to leave before justice found her. Torin increased security. Ragnar publicly executed 2 nobles caught plotting against her, but the hatred simmered. One evening, as Alara walked through the fortress garden, desperate for air that didn't taste like stone, a voice stopped her cold. You don't belong here. Alara turned. Lady Saren stood on the path behind her, a noble woman in her 30s, beautiful and cold as winter ice. Her family controlled half the kingdom's grain supply. Her word carried weight. I didn't choose this, Alara said quietly. No. You manipulated a grieving king with lies and a convenient child. Saren's smile was razor sharp. Do you think we're fools? That we can't see what you are? What am I? A survivor playing a long game. Saren stepped closer. But here's what you don't understand, Omega. This isn't the frontier. This is a court built on blood and tradition. And you— She looked Alara up and down with contempt. Are neither. Then why do you care? Alara asked, her voice hardening. If I'm nothing, why waste your breath? Saren's expression flickered, just for a moment, into something that looked like fear. Because if the king finds his son, she said quietly, and if that son acknowledges you, everything changes. Power shifts, alliances crumble, and people like me, her voice turned venomous, lose everything we've built. She walked away, leaving Alara standing alone in the garden. That night, Alara couldn't sleep. She stood at the window, staring out at the fortress walls, at the mountains beyond. Somewhere in those peaks, scouts were searching. Somewhere in the darkness, Darien might be alive. And somewhere in this fortress, enemies were gathering. Alara closed her eyes and made a decision. She wasn't going to wait for answers to find her. She was going to take them. The next morning, she found Torin in the training yard. I want to help with the investigation, she said without preamble. Torin paused mid-swing, his practice sword frozen in the air. Absolutely not. Why? Because you're not a soldier. You're not a tracker. And you're... He caught himself. An Omega? Ilara finished. Beneath notice? Torrin's jaw tightened. Vulnerable. The king's protection only extends so far. You leave this fortress, you're a target. I'm already a target, Ilara said, but I know things those scouts don't. I know where I found Darian. I know the cabin, the area. I could... No. Torrin's voice was absolute. The king would have my head. Then I'll ask the king myself. She turned to leave. Torrin caught her arm. Not roughly, but firm. You don't understand what you're asking, he said quietly. Those highlands are brutal. Mercenary territory. Raiders who'd sell you to the highest bidder without blinking. I survived them once, Ilara said, meeting his eyes. Before I had guards. Before I had the king's protection. I survived on nothing but instinct and luck. Her voice hardened. I can do it again. Torrin studied her for a long moment. Then he released her arm. Talk to the king, but don't say I didn't warn you. Ragnar's response was immediate and uncompromising. No. Ilara stood before the throne, refusing to bow. I can help. You can die, Ragnar said flatly, and I won't allow it. You don't control me. In this fortress, I control everything. But there was something in Ragnar's eyes, not anger, but fear. You want to find my son? So do I. But I won't trade your life for his. Why? Ilara demanded. Because I'm Omega? Because I'm beneath? Because you're the only proof I have that he survived. Ragnar's voice cracked like thunder. You and that boy are the only thread connecting me to hope. If I lose you... He stopped, breathing hard. I lose him all over again. Ilara's rage faltered. Ragnar descended from the throne, stopping inches from her. You want to help? Then stay alive. Raise my grandson. Keep his memory safe. His voice dropped. Let me do the fighting. Ilara wanted to argue, wanted to fight, but the raw pain in Ragnar's eyes stopped her. Fine, she said quietly, but if your scouts find him, when they find him, I want to be there when he comes home. Ragnar nodded slowly. You have my word. But fate, as always, had other plans. 2 days later, a scout returned with news that shattered everything. Torrin burst into Ilara's quarters, his face grim. The king wants you. Now. Ilara's heart lurched. What happened? We found something. The war room was chaos. Maps covered every surface. Scouts stood reporting in rapid bursts. Ragnar paced like a caged wolf. When Ilara entered, he turned. We found a mercenary camp in the northern highlands, he said without preamble. One of our scouts infiltrated, overheard conversations. His voice shook. They mentioned holding a high-value prisoner for 5 years. Someone they called the Wolf. Ilara's breath stopped. Darian called himself that. When he worked. He said it felt right. Ragnar's eyes blazed. Then he's alive. And they have him. Where? Ilara demanded. A stronghold called Blackstone Keep, built into the mountains, fortified, nearly impossible to assault. Torrin stabbed the map. Here. 3 days hard march. Then we march, Ragnar said. Your Majesty, Lady Maren said carefully. If this is a trap, then it's a trap I'm walking into. Ragnar's voice was steel. I've spent 5 years mourning a son who might be alive. I won't waste another day. He looked at Ilara. You wanted to help, then help. Tell me everything about how Darian fought, how he thought, anything that might help us reach him. Ilara's mind raced. He was strategic, patient, but when cornered, she met Ragnar's eyes. He fought like something wild, like survival was the only law he knew. Ragnar smiled, sharp and dangerous. Then he's still my son. He turned to Torrin. Gather the elite guard. We leave at dawn. The fortress mobilized. Soldiers armed themselves. Supplies were loaded. Battle plans were drawn and redrawn. Ilara stood in her quarters staring at armor Torrin had delivered, light leather, meant for scouts. Just in case, he'd said grimly. Kale watched from the bed. Are you leaving? No, Ilara said. The king is. To find my father? Ilara crossed to him, kneeling. Maybe. We don't know yet. Kael's eyes, those storm-gray eyes, were too old for a child. What if he doesn't remember us? The question Alara had been avoiding for weeks. Then we remind him, she said quietly. And if he still doesn't, she cupped Kael's face. Then we survive, like always. Kael nodded, but his lip trembled. Alara pulled him close, breathing in his scent, memorizing this moment. Because she could feel it, the way the world shifted when everything was about to change. Dawn came cold and brutal. Ragnar's army assembled in the courtyard. 200 soldiers, the best Ironridge had. They moved with disciplined silence, checking weapons, adjusting armor. Alara stood on the battlements, watching. Ragnar rode to the front on a massive war horse, his armor gleaming like moonlight on steel. He looked up, found Alara in the crowd, and nodded once. A promise. Or a farewell. Then he raised his sword, and the army moved. They marched north, toward the mountains, toward Blackstone Keep, toward answers that would either save a kingdom or destroy it. Alara watched until they disappeared into the tree line. Then she turned and walked back into the fortress, where Kael waited and enemies circled and the future hung balanced on a blade's edge. 3 days passed like years. No word came from the north. The fortress held its breath. Alara tried to maintain routine. Meals with Kael, lessons she barely absorbed, walks through gardens that felt like cages. But every moment, she felt the weight of waiting. On the 4th day, bells rang. Not alarm bells, victory bells. Alara ran to the battlements. The army was returning. Banners flew. Soldiers marched in formation. And at the center, flanked by Ragnar and Torin, a man. Tall, dark-haired, moving with the controlled grace of a predator. Even from a distance, even after 5 years, Alara knew. Darien. Her vision blurred. Her knees buckled. He was alive. The army entered the fortress. Crowds gathered, cheering. Alara pushed through them, Kael's hand tight in hers. The procession stopped in the main courtyard. Ragnar dismounted, turned, extended his hand. The man, Darien, dismounted slowly. His face was harder than Alara remembered. Scarred. His eyes swept the crowd with wariness that spoke of years in captivity. Then those eyes found hers. Everything stopped. Recognition flickered, confusion. Then something deeper. Memory crashing back like a flood. Darien stared at Alara, at Kael, and in a voice roughened by time and pain, he spoke. Alara? The name was a question, a prayer, a wound torn open. Alara's tears fell freely now. Yes. Darien's gaze dropped to Kael, to those storm-gray eyes that mirrored his own. Understanding broke across his face like dawn, and for the first time in 5 years, the lost prince of Ironridge fell to his knees. Darien knelt in the courtyard dirt like a man who'd forgotten how to stand. His eyes, those storm-gray eyes that Kael had inherited, moved between Alara and the boy with an expression that shattered her. Recognition, disbelief, and beneath it all, a grief so raw it felt like watching someone bleed out. How long? His voice was gravel scraped over stone. Alara's throat closed. 5 years. Darien's jaw worked. He looked at Kael again, really looked, taking in every detail. The shape of his face, the set of his shoulders, the way he stood without fear despite being surrounded by armed soldiers and a crowd that could crush him. What's your name? Darien asked quietly. Kael stepped forward, slipping free of Alara's grip. Kael Voss. But the king says I'm a thorn too. Something broke in Darien's expression. He reached out slowly, as if afraid the boy might vanish, and touched Kael's cheek with fingers that trembled. You have her eyes too, he whispered. I didn't think that was possible. Mama says I have the best parts of both of you. Darien's breath hitched. He looked up at Alara, and she saw tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. I tried to come back, he said, his voice cracking. When I remembered, when it all came flooding back, who I was, what I'd left behind, I tried. But they were waiting. Who? Ragnar's voice cut through the moment like a blade. Darien stood slowly, his movements stiff. Alara noticed now what she'd missed in the shock of seeing him. The scars, the way he favored his left side, the haunted wariness in his posture. "The Blackridge clan," Darian said, turning to his father. "Mercenaries. Raiders. They ambushed my unit 5 years ago, but I wasn't killed, I was taken." His hands clenched into fists. "They kept me in the mountains, tried to break me, use me as leverage against Ironridge." "For 5 years?" Torrin's voice was hard. "Why didn't they make demands?" "Because I wouldn't break," Darian said flatly. "And a prince who won't cooperate is worthless for negotiation. So they waited, tried different methods." His expression went cold. "They failed." Ragnar's face was stone, but his eyes blazed. "We'll discuss details inside, but first," he looked at Alara, then at Kael. "First, my son needs to know his family." The crowd began to disperse, though whispers followed like smoke. Alara felt the weight of 100 stares, the speculation, the judgment. Darian stepped closer to her. Up close, the changes were stark. He was leaner, harder, with new scars crossing his jaw and disappearing beneath his collar. But his eyes, when they met hers, still held that same intensity that had made her fall in love in a forest cabin a lifetime ago. "I dreamed about you," he said quietly. "In that cell. When everything else faded, I held on to the memory of you. The cabin. Winter mornings. The way you laughed when I burned breakfast." Alara's vision blurred. "I thought you'd forgotten me. That you'd remembered who you were and decided we weren't worth—" "No." Darian's hand found hers, rough and calloused. "Never. I was captured 3 miles from the fortress. I got that close before they took me down." His grip tightened. "I was coming home to you." Kael tugged on Darian's sleeve. "Are you staying now?" Darian looked down at his son, and something in his expression crumbled and rebuilt itself simultaneously. "Yes," he said, "I'm staying." But the fortress had other plans. The reunion lasted less than an hour before the council convened an emergency session. Alara wasn't invited, but she heard the shouting through the thick oak doors. Darian's voice raised in anger, Ragnar's, brooking no argument, and beneath it all, the advisors. Castor's nasal protests, Lady Marin's careful political maneuvering, others Alara didn't recognize. Torrin stood guard outside the chamber. He caught Alara's eye and shook his head minutely. "Stay out of it," the gesture said. "This isn't your battle." But it was. Every word spoken in that room would shape her future and Kael's. She retreated to her quarters, where Kael was already asleep, exhausted from the day's chaos. Alara sat by the window, watching torches flicker on the battlements, and waited. Darian came to her chambers near midnight. He knocked softly, then entered when she called permission. He looked worse than he had in the courtyard, armor removed, revealing a shirt that hung loose on a frame that had once been broader. The scars on his arms were extensive, layered over muscle, that spoke of hard labor and harder survival. "The council wants to deny it," he said without preamble. "Our connection, Kael's legitimacy. They're arguing that even if I fathered him, it was before I knew my own identity, that it doesn't count." Alara's hands clenched. "And what did you say?" "That they can take their denial and burn with it." Darian's voice was flat, exhausted. "But Castor's smart. He's arguing that acknowledging Kael sets a dangerous precedent, that any Omega could claim royal blood and destabilize the succession. That's absurd. That's politics." Darian crossed to the window, standing close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "My father supports us, but he's one voice against a council that fears change more than death." "So what happens now?" Darian turned to face her. "I claim you, publicly, formally. Make it impossible for them to deny." Alara's breath caught. "Claim me how?" "Marriage. Bonding. Whatever ritual will satisfy their bureaucratic souls." His expression softened. "I'm not asking because of politics, Alara. I'm asking because I should have asked 5 years ago, before everything went to hell." "You didn't know who you were 5 years ago." "I knew enough." Darian reached for her hand again, his touch gentle despite the calluses. "I knew I loved you. I knew leaving would destroy me. And when my memory returned and I realized I'd left you pregnant and alone," his voice broke. "It's haunted me every day since." Alara pulled her hand back, needing distance to think. You don't owe me anything. You were captured, tortured. You survived. That's enough. It's not. Darian's frustration bled through. You survived too. You raised our son alone in a world that should have crushed you. You walked into a royal fortress and demanded answers from a king. You're stronger than half the warriors in this place, and I... He stopped, jaw working. I want to be worthy of that strength.
You think marrying me makes you worthy? I think choosing you does. Darian met her eyes. Not because of duty or blood or politics, but because even if I'd never remembered, even if I'd stayed that nameless man in the cabin, I would have chosen you every time. The words hit like arrows finding gaps in armor. Alara wanted to believe him, wanted to fall into the fantasy that love could survive 5 years of separation, torture, and impossible odds. But she'd survived too long on pragmatism to trust in fairy tales. The council will fight this, she said quietly. Let them. Darian's expression hardened. I've spent 5 years fighting for survival. I can fight for this too. But the fight came faster and fiercer than either of them expected. 2 days after Darian's return, Lord Castor made his move. Alara was summoned to the council chamber, alone, without warning. Darian was occupied with military debriefings. Ragnar was reviewing intelligence from the Blackridge raid. She walked into that room with only her wits and the cold certainty that she was about to be devoured. Castor stood at the head of the table, flanked by 5 other advisors. No king, no allies. Omega Vos. Castor's smile was a blade wrapped in silk. Thank you for joining us. Alara said nothing, standing with her hands folded. We've been reviewing your situation, Castor continued, and while we sympathize with your claims, certain inconsistencies have emerged. What inconsistencies? Your timeline, for one. Castor gestured to a ledger on the table. You claim Prince Darian stayed with you for 6 months, 5 years ago, yet you only arrived at Ironridge Fortress 3 years ago. Where were you for the intervening 2 years? Alara's spine straightened. Surviving. In the frontier. Doing what? Trapping, trading, raising a child alone. Convenient, another advisor said, a heavy-set man named Lord Greaves, that you have no witnesses to corroborate this. I wasn't aware I'd need witnesses to prove my own life, Alara said coldly. Castor's smile widened. Here's what we propose. You take a settlement, gold, enough to live comfortably anywhere in the kingdom, and you leave. Quietly. You raise the boy elsewhere, and we acknowledge him as connected to the bloodline, but not legitimate. You want me to disappear? We want to avoid a succession crisis, Castor said smoothly. If Prince Darian formally claims you and the boy, it raises questions about legitimacy, about Omega rights, about whether love trumps tradition. He leaned forward. Those questions tear kingdoms apart. Or strengthen them, Alara said. You're naive. And you're terrified. Alara stepped closer to the table, her voice dropping to something dangerous. You're not afraid of me. You're afraid of what I represent. An Omega who won't bow. A woman who demanded answers from a king and lived. A precedent that says power isn't just birthright, it's earned. Castor's expression hardened. You overstep. I survive. Alara planted her hands on the table, leaning in. That's what you people don't understand. I don't want your politics or your gold or your approval. I want my son to know his father. I want to live without looking over my shoulder for the knife you're all sharpening. Her voice turned to steel. And I'll fight for that with everything I have. Then you'll lose, Castor said flatly. Because you're alone in this, Omega. Prince Darian may posture, but he's one man. The king may support you, but he's aging and his power wanes. And the council, he gestured to the assembled advisors, will never accept you. Then I'll make them. Castor laughed. How? By seducing more princes? By playing on sympathy? The insult hung in the air like poison. Alara straightened slowly. By telling the truth, loudly, publicly, to anyone who'll listen. She met each advisor's eyes in turn. You want me gone because you're afraid of exposure. Afraid that if people see an Omega stand up to power and win, they'll start asking why Omegas are kept down in the first place. You're delusional. Am I? Alara smiled, sharp and cold. Then call my bluff. Refuse to acknowledge Kael. Let's see how the kingdom reacts when they learn the council denied a war hero's son
because his mother wasn't high-born enough. Silence stretched. Castor's face was stone, but his eyes betrayed him, a flicker of uncertainty. "This meeting is over," he said tightly. "But this conversation isn't finished, Omega Voss. You do well to remember that walls have ears and loyalty is flexible." The threat was unmistakable. Alara walked out of that chamber with her head high and her heart hammering. She'd just declared war on the most powerful men in Ironridge, and she had no idea how to win. That night, Darian found her in the fortress library, a cavernous room lined with books that smelled of dust and old paper. She was staring at a map of the kingdom, tracing borders with her finger when he approached. "Torin told me about the council meeting," he said quietly. "Then you know what I said."
I know you threatened the most dangerous men in the kingdom." Darian moved to stand beside her. That was either brilliant or suicidal. Maybe both. Alara didn't look up from the map. "They wanted me to leave, take money, and disappear. And you refused." "I refused." She finally met his eyes. "I'm done running, Darian. I ran from my past, from my family's deaths, from everything that hurt. But running didn't save me. Standing my ground did." Her voice hardened. "So I'm standing."
Darian studied her for a long moment. Then he reached past her and tapped a location on the map, the frontier region where she'd found him. "You saved my life here," he said quietly. "Nursed me back from nothing. Gave me a reason to keep breathing when I had no memory of why I should." His finger moved to Ironridge. "And now you're fighting for our son in a place that wants to destroy you for daring to exist above your station. Are you trying to talk me into leaving?" "No." Darian's hand covered hers on the map. "I'm trying to tell you I'm with you, whatever happens, whatever they throw at us." His voice dropped. "I spent 5 years in a cell wishing I could get back to you. I'm not wasting another second letting fear or politics keep us apart." Alara felt something crack in her chest, the armor she'd built around her heart, the walls that had kept her safe through years of solitude. "The council will make it hell," she said. "Then we'll walk through hell together. They might try to kill me. Then I'll kill them first." Alara laughed, sharp and almost hysterical. "You can't kill the entire council. Watch me." But Darian was smiling, that rare expression that transformed his scarred face into something almost boyish. "We've survived worse, Alara. Both of us. Separately." His hand tightened on hers. "Together, we're unstoppable." She wanted to believe him, but belief was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not yet. The blow came 3 days later. Alara was walking with Kael through the fortress gardens when guards surrounded them. Not Torin's men. These wore different insignia, reporting to Lord Greaves. "Omega Voss," the lead guard said. "You're summoned." "By whom?" "The council. Immediately." Kael pressed against her side. "Mama?" "It's fine, little wolf." Alara kept her voice steady. "Stay with the guards. I'll be back soon." She was escorted, practically dragged, to a chamber she didn't recognize, smaller than the main council room. No windows, no witnesses. Castor waited inside along with Greaves and 2 other advisors she barely knew. "Sit," Castor said. "I'll stand." Castor's expression hardened. "We've received intelligence about your time in the frontier." Alara's blood went cold. "What intelligence?" "Testimonies. From traders who remember you." Greaves pushed a stack of papers across the table. "They claim you weren't alone when Prince Darian left, that you had other companions." The implication hit like a fist. "You're accusing me of infidelity." "We're suggesting," Castor said smoothly, "that the boy's parentage may not be as clear as you claim." Rage burned through Alara's chest. "Those testimonies are lies." "Are they? Or are they inconvenient truths?" Castor leaned back. "You see, Omega Voss, we've done our research, and what we've found is a woman who survived in brutal conditions by whatever means necessary, trade, barter, perhaps other arrangements. You're inventing stories to discredit me. We're uncovering facts you'd prefer stayed buried." Greaves's smile was vicious. "The council will vote tomorrow on whether to proceed with a formal inquiry into the boy's bloodline. If these testimonies hold, they won't." Darian's voice cut through the room like a blade. Every head turned. The prince stood in the doorway, still in training gear, sweat slicked and radiating barely controlled violence.
How did you? Castor started. Torin's loyal to me, not you.
Darian stepped into the room, his presence filling the space.
And I've heard enough.
He looked at the papers on the table. Fabricated testimonies, conveniently timed, designed to destroy Alara's credibility before tomorrow's vote.
These are legitimate. These are lies, Darian said flatly.
And I'm done playing your games. He moved to stand beside Alara, his shoulder brushing hers. Kyle is my son. Alara is his mother. That's not negotiable. The council, Darian interrupted, his voice dropping to something deadly, will vote to acknowledge my family, or they'll face the consequences. Castor stood slowly. Are you threatening us, Prince Darian? I'm making a promise. Darian's eyes were iron. I've spent 5 years being tortured by men who thought they could break me. I didn't break then. I won't break now. He stepped closer to Castor. You want to question Kyle's legitimacy? Fine. Let's put it to a test. Blood magic, healer verification, whatever arcane ritual will satisfy your paranoia. That's not... But when the test proves I'm right, Darian continued, his voice cutting through protests, you will publicly apologize. You will acknowledge Kyle, and you will accept Alara as part of this family. His smile was sharp as broken glass. Or I walk. Leave the fortress. Renounce my claim to the throne. And you can explain to my father why his only heir abandoned the kingdom because you couldn't accept an Omega. Dead silence. Castor's face cycled through fury, calculation, fear. Finally, he nodded stiffly. We'll proceed with verification. Tomorrow. Good. Darian took Alara's hand. We're done here. They left the chamber together, Darian's grip almost painful in its intensity. Outside, Alara finally exhaled. You shouldn't have threatened them. I meant every word. They'll retaliate. Let them try. Darian stopped, pulling her around to face him. I lost 5 years, Alara. 5 years of watching Kyle grow. 5 years of not being there when you needed me. His voice shook. I'm not losing another second to men who think power comes from bloodline instead of character. And if the test fails, if somehow... It won't. Darian cupped her face, his touch gentle, despite the calluses. Because Kyle is mine. I see it every time he looks at me, every time he stands straight like he's ready to fight the world. His thumb brushed her cheek. He's got your stubbornness and my recklessness. That combination could only come from us. Alara leaned into his touch, letting herself, just for a moment, believe in certainty. But the fortress had taught her that certainty was an illusion. The verification ritual took place at dawn in the Hall of Valor, the same hall where Kyle had first pointed to Darian's portrait, the same hall where Alara had asked the question that shattered everything. Now it hosted a ceremony that would either vindicate her or destroy her. Matron Hilda presided, assisted by 2 other healers. Ragnar stood at the front, his expression carved from granite. The council assembled in witness, Castor, Greaves, Marin, and a dozen others. Alara stood with Kyle on one side and Darian on the other, forming a triangle in the center of the hall. The verification is simple, Hilda announced, her voice carrying. Blood calls to blood. Thorn lineage carries markers that cannot be faked. She held up a ceremonial blade. Each participant gives blood. We test for resonance. Resonance? Kyle whispered. Magic, Darian murmured. Old magic. The kind that built this kingdom. Hilda approached Ragnar first. Your Majesty. The king extended his hand without hesitation. Hilda pricked his palm, catching blood in a silver bowl. Then she turned to Darian. Prince Darian. Darian held out his hand. The blade bit deep. His blood joined his father's, and immediately the mixture began to glow, faint but unmistakable. Silver-white light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Murmurs rippled through the assembled witnesses. Father and son, Hilda confirmed. The bond is clear. Now she approached Kyle. The boy looked up at Alara, uncertainty in his eyes. It's okay, little wolf, Alara whispered. It won't hurt much. Kyle nodded and extended his small hand. Hilda pricked his finger. Blood welled, darker than the adult's, still carrying the richness of childhood. It dripped into the bowl.
For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. Castor's smile began to form. Then the bowl erupted with light.
Silver-white brilliance flooded the hall, so bright that people shielded their eyes. The light condensed into patterns, swirling runes that hadn't been seen in generations, old magic responding to old blood. When it faded, the bowl contained liquid that looked like molten starlight. Hilda stared at it, her ancient face shocked. "I've never—" She looked up at Ragnar. "Your Majesty, this child doesn't just carry thorn blood. He carries it strongly, stronger than some of your direct ancestors." Ragnar's expression cracked into something that might have been joy. Castor looked like he'd swallowed glass. "The verification is conclusive," Hilda announced to the assembled court. "Kyle Voss is Prince Darien's son, legitimate heir to the Thorn bloodline." The hall erupted. Some advisors applauded. Others looked murderous. The crowd of witnesses, servants, soldiers, nobles, erupted in speculation. Alara felt her knees go weak. Darien caught her, his arm around her waist. "We did it," he murmured. But Alara was watching Castor's face. The advisor's expression had shifted from defeat to something far more dangerous. Calculation. The celebration lasted barely an hour before everything collapsed. Alara was walking back to her quarters with Kyle, finally allowing herself to feel relief, when Torrin intercepted them. His face was ashen. "Where's Darien?" "With his father, planning—" "Get him, now!" Torrin's voice was urgent. "We have a problem." They found Darien and Ragnar in the war room, poring over maps and troop deployments. "What is it?" Ragnar demanded when Torrin burst in. "Blackridge clan," Torrin said. "They're mobilizing. Our scouts report movement in the highlands. Significant movement. At least 3,000 fighters." The blood drained from Darien's face. "They're coming here." "Why?" Ragnar's voice was sharp. "We destroyed their stronghold, freed you. What's left to fight for?" "Revenge," Darien said quietly. And he stopped, his expression darkening. "They think I have something, information they want." "What information?" Darien hesitated, looked at Alara, then back to his father. "The reason they kept me alive for 5 years wasn't just leverage," he said slowly. "I overheard things. Plans. They're not just a mercenary clan. They're funded, organized, building toward something." "Toward what?" Torrin demanded. "War." Darien's voice was flat. "With Ironridge. They've been gathering allies, stockpiling weapons, mapping our defenses. And they think I memorized enough during my captivity to expose their entire network." Silence crashed down. "Did you?" Ragnar asked. "Some of it. Enough to be dangerous." Darien looked at the maps. "But if they're marching on Ironridge, it's not just to kill me, it's to send a message that they're strong enough to attack us directly." Ragnar's expression hardened. "How long until they arrive?" 3 days, Torrin said. "Maybe 4 if weather slows them." "Then we have 3 days to prepare." Ragnar turned to his advisors. "Evacuate the outer villages, recall all border patrols, fortify the walls, and—" He looked at Alara. "Get civilians to the inner keep, especially women and children." "No," Alara's voice cut through the plans. Every head turned. "No?" Ragnar repeated. "I'm not hiding." Alara stepped forward. "If they're coming because of Darien, and Darien's here because of me, then I'm part of this." "You're not a soldier," Torrin said. "I'm a survivor." Alara met his eyes. "And I can fight." "Absolutely not," Darien said. "Alara, you'll be in the safest—" "I'll be wherever I'm most useful." Alara's voice was steel. "I survived the frontier. I survived this court. I can survive a siege." "This isn't about survival," Darien said desperately. "This is about keeping you and Kale safe. Kale will be safe in the inner keep with the other children. But me?" Alara stepped closer. "I'm done being protected like I'm fragile. I'm done being sidelined because I'm Omega." She looked at Ragnar. "You need every able body. I can shoot. I can tend wounded. I can do something other than sit in a tower waiting to see if the men I love survive." Ragnar studied her for a long moment. Then, impossibly, he smiled. "You're just like her." "Like who?" "My wife, Darien's mother." Ragnar's expression softened. She refused to be protected too,
insisted on riding beside me in campaigns, tending wounded, fighting when necessary. His voice roughened. She was the strongest person I ever knew. He turned to Torin. Give Omega Voss a bow. Station her on the walls. If she wants to fight, let her fight. Darien looked stricken. Father, your mother would approve, Ragnar said quietly. And so do I. Alara felt something shift in her chest. Validation, recognition, respect. For the first time since entering Ironridge Fortress, she felt seen. The next 3 days were chaos. Soldiers drilled day and night. Weapons were sharpened. Supplies stockpiled. The fortress transformed into a war machine, every person moving with deadly purpose. Alara trained with the archers. Her aim was rusty, but muscle memory returned. She'd hunted for survival in the frontier, tracking, patience, the steady hand needed to bring down prey at distance. Now the prey wore armor and carried weapons that could kill her. On the second night, Darien found her on the battlements, testing the pull on her borrowed bow. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. Yes, I do. Alara knocked an arrow, sighting down the length. If I hide, I'm the helpless Omega they all think I am. If I fight, she released. The arrow flew true, slamming into a practice target 100 yards distant. I'm something they have to acknowledge. Darien moved beside her, his presence warm against the cold night air. I'm terrified of losing you. I'm terrified of losing you too. Alara lowered the bow. But hiding won't keep either of us safe. Only winning will. And if we don't win? Alara turned to face him. Then we die fighting, together, and Kael will know that his parents stood for something. Darien pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her like he could shield her from the coming storm. When this is over, he whispered into her hair, I'm making you my wife. Formal ceremony. Every ritual the council demands. I'm claiming you so thoroughly that no one will ever question it again. Alara smiled against his chest. Promises made on battlements don't count. Then I'll make it again, on the other side of hell. They stood there, wrapped in each other, while the fortress prepared for war. On the third day, the Blackridge clan arrived. Alara stood on the eastern wall, bow in hand, watching the army emerge from the forest like a plague. 3,000 fighters, maybe more, armored in patchwork metal and leather, carrying weapons that looked brutal and effective. At their head rode a figure in black armor, face hidden behind a helm carved to resemble a skull. That's their war chief, Torin said, appearing beside Alara. Callous the Broken, meaner than any bastard you've ever met. Charming, Alara muttered. Below, Ragnar stood at the main gate, Darien beside him, 100 soldiers at their backs. Callous rode forward alone, stopping 50 yards from the wall. Ragnar Thorn! His voice carried like thunder. Return what you stole, and we'll consider mercy. I stole nothing, Ragnar's voice boomed. I freed my son from captivity. Your son carries information that belongs to us, Callous pointed at Darien. Send him out, or we burn your fortress to ash. Come and try, Ragnar roared. Callous laughed, a sound like grinding stone. Then he raised his hand. From the forest, siege engines emerged, catapults, ballistae, towers built for scaling walls. Alara's blood ran cold. This wasn't a raid, this was an invasion. Archers! Torin's command echoed along the wall. Ready! Alara knocked an arrow, her heart hammering. Callous lowered his hand. The siege engines fired. Massive stones arced through the air, trailing smoke. They slammed into Ironridge's walls with impacts that shook the battlements. Alara staggered, grabbing the parapet for balance. Return fire! Torin roared. Arrows filled the sky like a lethal rain. The battle for Ironridge had begun, and Alara stood at the center of it, bow drawn, target acquired, choosing survival over surrender one arrow at a time. Alara's arrow flew into the mass of advancing soldiers and found flesh. A Blackridge fighter stumbled, clutching his shoulder, and was trampled by the men behind him. She knocked another arrow, sighted, released. The rhythm became mechanical. Draw, aim, fire. Don't think about the lives ending at the other end of her shots. Think only about the lives she was protecting. Around her, the wall erupted with violence. Arrows screamed through the air in both directions.
Siege stones crashed against Ironridge's ancient stonework, sending tremors through the battlements. Soldiers shouted orders, coordinating defenses, dragging wounded back from the parapet. "They're bringing the towers!" someone yelled. Alara risked a glance. 3 massive siege towers were rolling toward the walls, pushed by teams of Blackridge fighters hidden behind reinforced shields. Once those towers reached the wall, the enemy would pour over like a flood. "Oil!" Torin roared. "Now!" Cauldrons of boiling oil were tipped over the wall's edge. Screams rose as the liquid found targets, but the towers kept coming. Alara shifted her aim to the shield bearers pushing the leftmost tower. Her arrows punched through gaps in their formation. One man fell, then another, but there were always more to replace them. The tower hit the wall with a thunderous crash. A boarding ramp slammed down onto the battlements 10 yards from where Alara stood. Blackridge fighters poured across like ants, screaming battle cries that turned her blood to ice. "Hold the line!" Torin bellowed, charging forward with his sword drawn. Ironridge soldiers met the invaders with steel and fury. The battlements became a slaughterhouse, men hacking at each other in tight quarters, no room for fancy technique, just brutal efficiency. Alara dropped her bow and drew the knife Torin had given her. A Blackridge fighter broke through the line, charging straight at her. She didn't think, just moved. Stepped inside his swing, drove her blade up under his ribs, and twisted. He went down gurgling. Alara yanked her knife free, already turning toward the next threat. A massive brute with a spiked club raised his weapon. And Darian appeared from nowhere, his sword taking the man's head clean off. "What are you doing up here?" he roared at Alara over the din of battle. "My job!" she screamed back, stabbing another attacker who'd gotten too close. Darian fought like something unleashed, 5 years of captivity and rage channeled into lethal precision. Every movement was calculated death. Every strike found vital targets, but there were too many. For every enemy that fell, 2 more climbed the tower. "We can't hold this position," Torin shouted, his scarred face streaked with blood. "Fall back to the inner wall." The retreat was chaos. Soldiers grabbed wounded comrades, carrying them toward the stairs while archers provided covering fire. Alara ran with them, her lungs burning, Darian's hand locked around her wrist to keep them together. They'd barely reached the inner courtyard when the eastern wall fell. Blackridge fighters flooded through, their war cries echoing off stone. The fortress's outer defenses had lasted less than 2 hours. Ragnar stood in the center of the courtyard, his armor splattered with blood that wasn't his. "Secondary positions, hold the inner keep." Soldiers scrambled to obey. Barricades were erected. Archers took positions on the inner walls. The civilians, women, children, elderly, were shepherded into the keep's lowest levels, where the stone was thickest. Alara caught sight of a servant carrying Kael toward the keep entrance. Her son's eyes were wide with fear, searching the crowd. She pushed through soldiers until Kael saw her. "Mama!" She ran to him, dropping to her knees. "You're safe. Stay in the keep. Don't come out no matter what you hear." "I'm scared," Kael whispered. "I know." Alara pulled him close, breathing in his scent. "But you're brave. Braver than anyone I know. And when this is over," her voice cracked. "When this is over, we'll still be here. Together." Kael nodded against her shoulder. A servant pulled him gently away. Alara watched until he disappeared into the keep, then turned back to the battle. Darian found her immediately. "You should be with him. He's safer without me drawing attention." Alara wiped blood from her knife. "Where do you need me?" Darian looked like he wanted to argue. Then he saw her expression, the set of her jaw, the steel in her eyes, and recognized the futility. "East barricade," he said. "Help the wounded get to the healers." Alara ran. The east barricade was a nightmare. Wounded soldiers lay everywhere, some screaming, others ominously silent. The healers worked with frantic efficiency, but there were too many injured and not enough hands. Alara dove in. She'd tended Darian's wounds in the cabin, had learned field medicine through necessity. She tied tourniquets, packed wounds with cloth, administered what little pain relief they had. A young soldier, barely 18, grabbed her wrist. "Am I dying?" Alara looked at the arrow buried in his chest, the blood frothing at his lips. She knew fatal wounds when she saw them. "No," she lied, taking his hand. "You're going to be fine." He smiled weakly and closed his eyes.
He was gone in minutes. Alara had no time to grieve. The next wounded soldier needed her attention, and the next, and the next. Hours blurred together. Day faded into night, the battle illuminated by burning buildings and torches. Somewhere around midnight, Torin appeared at the healer's station, his armor dented and blood-soaked. "We're holding," he said grimly. "But barely. Callus is throwing everything at us." "What does he want?" Alara asked, wrapping a soldier's arm. "If this is about information Darian has, why not just negotiate?" "Because negotiation implies we have something he needs." Torin's expression darkened. "He's not here to bargain. He's here to prove a point. That Ironridge can be touched, wounded. That even the great Thorn bloodline can bleed." "Then we prove him wrong," Alara said quietly. Torin studied her for a long moment. "You know, when you first walked into that fortress claiming royal connection, I thought you were either insane or suicidal. And now? Now I think you might be the toughest person in this entire building." He almost smiled. "Don't die, Omega. We need people like you." He disappeared back into the battle. Alara returned to her work, but Torin's words echoed. "We need people like you, not Omegas, not servants. People." It was the first time anyone in Ironridge had acknowledged her as an equal. Dawn came gray and bloody. The Black Ridge assault had paused during the night, not out of mercy, but because fighting in darkness favored defenders. But with sunrise, the attack resumed with renewed ferocity. Alara stood on the inner wall, bowback in hand, watching the enemy regroup. Callus the Broken rode through his troops, his skull-faced helm catching the early light. He was rallying them, his voice carrying even from a distance. "One more push! The keep falls today!" His soldiers roared approval. Alara looked at the defenders around her, exhausted, wounded, running on fumes and desperation. They couldn't survive another full assault. Ragnar appeared beside her, his face haggard. "How many arrows left?" "Maybe 50 per archer," Torin reported. "After that, we're down to melee." "Then we make every arrow count." Ragnar's voice was hoarse but unbroken. "And when the arrows run out, we make every sword stroke count. And when the swords break," he looked at his soldiers, "we fight with our bare hands, because this is Ironridge, and we don't surrender." The soldiers cheered, a ragged sound, but genuine. Alara felt something shift in her chest. These people, nobles and servants, soldiers and healers, were united by something stronger than hierarchy or bloodline. They were fighting for survival, for each other, for the right to exist without bowing to brutality. It was the same fight she'd been waging her entire life, just on a larger scale. The assault began. Siege towers rolled forward again, ladders slammed against walls, Black Ridge fighters climbed like a swarm of armored insects. Alara fired arrow after arrow. Her shoulders screamed, her fingers bled from the bowstring, but she didn't stop. Beside her, an archer took a crossbow bolt to the throat and fell. Alara grabbed his quiver, adding his arrows to her own dwindling supply. The enemy reached the wall. Hand-to-hand combat erupted. Alara dropped her bow and drew her knife again, fighting shoulder to shoulder with soldiers who'd stopped seeing her as Omega and started seeing her as one of them. A Black Ridge fighter grabbed her from behind. She drove her head back into his face, felt his nose crunch, spun, and buried her blade in his neck. He dropped. She kept fighting. Somewhere in the chaos, she heard Darian's voice roaring orders, saw Ragnar cutting through enemies like a force of nature, watched Torin rally defenders who'd been ready to break, and she understood something she'd never consciously articulated before. Strength wasn't about bloodline or station. It was about refusing to fall when everything demanded you kneel. That's what made someone royal. Not crowns or titles, but the will to keep standing. Midday arrived, and the battle reached a breaking point. The Black Ridge forces had breached the inner courtyard. Fighting raged everywhere, in corridors, on staircases, in rooms that had never seen violence. Alara found herself defending the healer's station from 3 attackers. She'd lost her knife somewhere and fought with a broken spear she'd pulled from a corpse. One attacker went down to a spear thrust. The second fell when a defender appeared and took his head. The third knocked the spear from Alara's hands and grabbed her throat. She clawed at his fingers, vision graying. Matron Hilda appeared behind him and drove a surgical blade into his kidney. He collapsed, and Alara gasped for air. "Omegas helping Omegas," Hilda rasped, offering a blood-stained hand. Novel concept. Alara laughed, hysterical and exhausted. We should start a movement. After we survive this nightmare. They fought back-to-back old healer and young survivor, protecting wounded who couldn't protect themselves. And somehow, impossibly, they held. The turning point came when Darian made a decision that defied all logic. Alara was helping carry a wounded soldier toward the keep when she heard shouting from the main courtyard. She turned to see Darian standing on the battlements, alone, visible to both armies. "Callus!" His voice carried like thunder. "I'm the one you want, so here I am." The fighting paused. Soldiers on both sides turned to watch. Callus emerged from his command position, skull helm glinting. "You offering yourself, princeling?" "I'm offering a duel," Darian shouted back. "You and me. Single combat. Winner takes the field." Ragnar's voice roared from below. "Darian, no!" But Darian ignored him. "You claim you want information I have? Then fight me for it. Prove you're not just a coward hiding behind numbers." Callus laughed. "And if I win? You get me alive, you get whatever intelligence you think I have, and your forces leave Ironridge. And if you win, your army withdraws, you take your wounded and go, and you never threaten this kingdom again." Silence stretched. Alara's blood ran cold. She pushed through the crowd, reaching the base of the wall where Darian stood. "Don't do this!" she screamed up at him. Darian looked down at her. Their eyes met across the distance. "I have to," he said quietly. "It's the only way to end this without everyone dying." "You'll die!" "Maybe." His expression softened. "But you and Kale will live. That's all that matters." Alara felt tears streaming down her face. "You promised. You said after this we'd—" "I'll keep that promise," Darian interrupted. "Watch me." Callus's voice cut through the moment. "I accept your terms, Prince. Let's see if Thornblood is as strong as the legends claim." A circle was cleared in the courtyard. Soldiers from both sides formed a ring, weapons lowered, watching. Darian descended from the wall. Ragnar grabbed his arm. "This is madness," the king said, voice shaking. "This is strategy." Darian met his father's eyes. "Callus is arrogant, brutal, but he's fought 1,000 battles. He's confident he'll win. And if he does? Then you know what information I have." Darian pressed something into Ragnar's hand, a folded piece of parchment. "Everything I learned in captivity, names, supply routes, plans, it's all there." Ragnar stared at the paper, then at his son. "You magnificent fool." "I learned from the best." Darian embraced his father briefly. Then he turned to where Alara stood. She ran to him. He caught her, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "If you die," she whispered against his chest, "I will find a way to resurrect you just so I can kill you myself." Darian laughed, sharp and pained. "That's fair." He pulled back, cupping her face. "I love you. I should have said it 5 years ago. I should have said it every day since I remembered. But I'm saying it now." His thumb brushed away her tears. "I love you, Alara Voss. And when I win, because I will win, I'm going to marry you, publicly, proudly, so thoroughly that the entire kingdom will know you're mine." Alara kissed him, desperate, terrified, furious. "Don't you dare lose." "Not a chance." He stepped away from her and walked into the circle. Callus waited, having removed his skull helm to reveal a face crisscrossed with scars. He was massive, taller than Darian, broader, built like a siege engine. He carried a war hammer that looked like it could shatter stone. Darian held only his sword, the blade he'd carried since becoming a soldier. "Any last words, Princeling?" Callus asked. Darian smiled. "Just one. Duck." Callus frowned. Darian moved, not toward Callus, under him. He dropped into a slide that took him beneath the warhammer's first massive swing. His sword flashed upward, cutting a line across Callus's thigh. The war chief stumbled, caught off guard by the unconventional tactic. Darian rolled to his feet, already spinning into his next attack. What followed wasn't a duel. It was a lesson in survival versus strength. Callus fought like a mountain, immovable, overwhelming, every swing capable of ending the fight. But he was used to opponents who met force with force. Darian had learned a different kind of fighting in those 5 years of captivity. He fought like water,
flowing around attacks, finding gaps, exploiting weaknesses. He didn't try to block the warhammer. He avoided it. Slide, duck, roll, strike and retreat. Death by 1,000 cuts. Callus roared in frustration, swinging harder, faster, and exhausting himself. Darien waited, patient, watching for the opening. It came when Callus overextended on a downward strike. The warhammer hit stone and stuck for a fraction of a second. Darien's sword took Callus in the shoulder, deep, crippling. The war chief howled and staggered back, his right arm useless. Darien pressed the advantage. He moved inside Callus's guard, sword flashing in a pattern too fast to follow. Cut the left arm, slash across the ribs, sweep the legs. Callus crashed to his knees. Darien's sword came to rest against the war chief's throat. Dead silence filled the courtyard. "Yield," Darien said quietly. Callus's face twisted with fury and pain. "You think my men will honor this bargain?" "I think," Darien said, pressing the blade slightly deeper, drawing blood, "that if they don't, they'll die. Because Ironridge will fight to the last man. And your forces," he looked at the Blackridge soldiers watching, "are already exhausted, wounded. You've lost a third of your strength trying to break these walls." He raised his voice so everyone could hear. "You came for information, for leverage, but you're leaving with a warning instead. Ironridge doesn't break, Ironridge doesn't bow, and anyone who tests that truth again," his eyes swept the enemy ranks, "won't leave at all." Callus breathed hard, blood seeping from multiple wounds. Finally, he nodded. "I yield." Darien stepped back, lowering his sword. Ironridge erupted in cheers. Blackridge soldiers began lowering their weapons, collecting their wounded, preparing to withdraw. Alara ran to Darien. He caught her, lifting her off her feet, spinning her around despite his own wounds. "Told you I'd win," he said against her hair. "You're insufferable." "You love me anyway." "Unfortunately." Ragnar approached, his expression caught between pride and exasperation. "That was the most reckless, idiotic, brilliant thing I've ever seen." "Thank you?" Darien set Alara down but kept one arm around her waist. "Don't thank me yet." Ragnar's smile was sharp. "You just publicly claimed an Omega in front of both armies. You realize what that means? That the Council can't deny her anymore? That you've set a precedent that will change this kingdom." Ragnar looked at Alara. "Whether we're ready or not." Alara met his gaze steadily. "I didn't ask for this." "No, but you earned it." "Oh." Ragnar extended his hand, not as king to subject, but as equal to equal. "Welcome to the family, Alara Voss. Officially." Alara took his hand, her throat tight with emotion she couldn't name. Around them, soldiers cheered, not just for victory, but for the Omega who'd fought beside them, the prince who'd defied tradition, the family built on choice instead of obligation. The Blackridge forces withdrew by sunset, carrying their wounded and their shattered war chief. Ironridge began the grim work of recovery, counting the dead, tending the wounded, rebuilding what had been destroyed. Alara worked alongside the healers until her hands were numb and her back screamed. Only when Matron Hilda physically pushed her toward the keep did she finally stop. "You've done enough, child. Rest." Alara wanted to argue, but exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. She stumbled to her quarters to find Kael asleep in her bed, curled around a pillow. She cleaned the worst of the blood from her hands and face, then crawled in beside him. He stirred. "Mama? I'm here, little wolf." "Is it over?" "Yes, we won." Kael snuggled closer. "I knew you would." Alara held him until his breathing deepened into sleep. Then she let herself cry, silent tears of relief and grief and exhaustion. They'd survived. Against impossible odds, against an army, against the Council's hatred and the kingdom's prejudice. They'd survived. Morning came with unexpected news. Alara woke to find Darien sitting beside her bed, cleaned up but bandaged in several places. "The Council convened at dawn," he said without preamble. Alara sat up, instantly alert. And Lord Castor tried one last time to deny our union. Cited tradition, proper procedure, the importance of maintaining bloodline purity. Darien's smile was sharp. Then Lady Marin stood up. "Marin, she's been neutral at best." "Not anymore." Darian leaned back. She told the council that anyone who fought as Alara fought, who defended Ironridge as fiercely as any soldier, deserved recognition. She said denying you would make the council look weak, petty, afraid of change. Alara's eyes widened. She said that? Publicly, in front of everyone. Darian took her hand. Then Torin spoke. Then 3 other advisors who'd watched you work the healer's station. Then soldiers started showing up, just appearing in the council chamber, testifying that you'd fought beside them. What did Ragnar do? Called for a vote. Darian's smile widened. 14-6, in our favor. Alara couldn't breathe. 14? The council officially recognizes our union, recognizes Kyle as legitimate heir, and, Darian squeezed her hand, grants you the title of princess consort. The words didn't register at first. Princess, her, the Omega who'd scrubbed floors and survived on scraps. I don't want a title, she said quietly. I know, but it's not about the title. Darian pulled her closer. It's about what it represents, that you can't be dismissed anymore, can't be threatened or undermined or told you don't belong. He stood, extending his hand. Come with me. Alara took it, letting him lead her through corridors she'd once cleaned, past servants who now bowed to her, into the Hall of Valor, the same hall where this had all begun. The same portrait that Kyle had recognized. But now, workers were installing a new portrait beside it. Alara stopped breathing. The painting showed her, not in servant's clothes, but in armor, bow in hand, standing on Ironridge's walls with the fortress behind her and fire in her eyes. Beneath it, a nameplate read, Alara Voss Thorn, Defender of Ironridge, Omega, Warrior, Princess. When did... She couldn't finish the question. I commissioned it yesterday, Ragnar's voice said from behind her, before the battle. Because I knew... The king stepped beside her, looking up at the portrait. I knew that whether we won or lost, you deserved to be remembered. Not as the Omega who made a claim, but as the woman who changed everything. Alara stared at her own painted face, seeing a stranger. Someone strong, fierce, unbreakable. Someone she'd had to become to survive. Thank you, she whispered. Ragnar nodded. The coronation ceremony is in 3 days. Until then, he smiled. Welcome to the nightmare of royal politics. Can't wait, Alara said dryly. Ragnar laughed and left them alone. Darian wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. What are you thinking? That 6 weeks ago I was scrubbing this floor. Alara leaned back against him. And now I'm going to be painted on the wall above it. Poetic justice. Terrifying irony. Both. Darian turned her to face him. But you know what the best part is? What? In 3 days, I'm marrying you. And there's not a damn thing anyone can do to stop it. Alara smiled, genuine and free. I'm holding you to that promise. I'm counting on it. They stood in the Hall of Valor, wrapped in each other, beneath portraits of warriors and kings, and now, impossibly, an Omega who'd refused to disappear. Outside, Ironridge was healing, wounds were mending, walls were being rebuilt, and in the keep's inner chambers, Kyle was being fitted for formal clothes for his mother's coronation. The kingdom was changing, not because tradition demanded it, but because one woman had dared to speak the truth and refused to be silenced, and that truth had reshaped everything. The 3 days before the coronation passed in a blur of preparation that felt both surreal and suffocating. Alara stood in chambers that had once belonged to Darian's mother, being fitted for ceremonial robes by seamstresses who'd probably gossiped about her incompetence as a servant. Now they worked in reverent silence, adjusting fabric that cost more than Alara had earned in her entire life. Arms up, my lady, the head seamstress murmured. Alara complied, catching her reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman staring back wore midnight blue silk embroidered with silver wolves, the Thorn family sigil. Her hair, usually pulled back in a practical braid, had been styled into something elegant and unfamiliar. She looked like someone playing dress-up in another person's life. I can't breathe in this, Ilar said. You'll adjust, my lady. The seamstress pinned another section.
Royalty often requires discomfort. That should be the kingdom's motto, Alara muttered.
A knock interrupted the fitting. Darian entered without waiting for permission, still moving with the slight stiffness of healing wounds. The seamstresses curtsied and fled, leaving them alone. Darian studied Alara in her formal robes. "You look ridiculous, dangerous." He crossed to her, his hands finding her waist, like someone who could rule kingdoms without raising her voice. "I don't want to rule anything. I just want to survive this ceremony without embarrassing myself." "Impossible. You're going to be magnificent." Darian's expression turned serious. "But I need to warn you about something." Alara's stomach dropped. "What now?" "Castor. He's accepted the council's vote, but he's not finished fighting." Darian released her, pacing to the window. "He's been meeting with other nobles, quietly building opposition." "Opposition to what?" "The council already voted." "To everything you represent. Change, breaking tradition. Omega's rising above their station." Darian's jaw tightened. "He can't stop the coronation, but he can make your life as princess consort a living hell, undermine every decision, question every action, turn the court into a battlefield." "So, business as usual," Alara said dryly. "I'm serious, Alara. He's dangerous because he's patient. He'll smile during the ceremony and plot your downfall the moment it's over." Alara met his eyes in the mirror. "Then let him plot. I didn't survive the frontier, the council, and a siege to be intimidated by a man who's afraid of change." Darian smiled, sharp and proud. "There's the woman I fell in love with. She never left. She just got better armor." But that night, alone in the dark with Kael sleeping beside her, Alara let herself feel the fear she couldn't show anyone else. She'd fought her way into this position through sheer stubborn survival. But surviving and thriving were different things. Could she actually be what they needed her to be? A princess? A political force? Someone worthy of standing beside Darian? Or would she crumble under the weight of expectations she'd never asked to carry? Kael stirred, mumbling in his sleep. Alara stroked his hair, grounding herself in the one thing that had never wavered, her love for this child. Everything else could fall apart. But Kael would always be worth fighting for. That would have to be enough. The coronation ceremony was scheduled for midday in the Great Hall, the fortress's largest chamber, normally used for major celebrations and state functions. Alara had never been inside it as anything other than staff, cleaning up after events she'd never been invited to attend. Now she stood in an antechamber, dressed in those midnight blue robes, while matron Hilda made final adjustments to her appearance. "Stop fidgeting," Hilda said, fastening a silver circlet into Alara's hair. "I'm not fidgeting." "You've adjusted that sleeve 6 times in the last minute." Alara forced her hands to her sides. "I hate this." "I know." Hilda stepped back, examining her work. "But you're doing it anyway. That's what makes you stronger than most of the nobility in that hall." "They're going to tear me apart." "Some will try. Others will respect you for surviving this far." Hilda's ancient eyes softened. "And a very few, will see you as what you actually are. Proof that strength isn't about birth, but about refusal to break." "Is that what you see?" "Child, I've been a healer for 60 years. I've watched kings and beggars die, and I'll tell you a secret." Hilda leaned closer. "At the end, blood doesn't matter. Titles don't matter. What matters is whether you fought for something beyond yourself." She straightened, brushing invisible dust from Alara's shoulder. "You fought for your son, for truth, for the right to exist without apology." "That's more royal than any crown." The door opened. Torin stood in the entrance, dressed in formal armor that made him look even more imposing. "It's time," he said. Alara's heart hammered. "Where's Kael?" "With the king. He'll be presented during the ceremony." Torin extended his arm. "May I?" Alara took it, grateful for the solid strength of someone who'd become an unexpected ally. They walked through corridors filled with nobles and servants, all dressed in their finest. Conversation stopped as Alara passed. Some faces showed curiosity, others thinly veiled contempt. Alara kept her chin up and her expression neutral. The great hall doors stood open, revealing a chamber packed with hundreds of people. Every noble family in Ironridge territory had sent representatives. Soldiers lined the walls. Servants filled the upper galleries. At the far end, on a raised platform, stood Ragnar in full ceremonial armor. Beside him, Darien wore the formal robes of a crown prince, dark blue and silver, matching Alara's. And between them, looking impossibly small but standing straight and proud, was Kael. Alara's throat tightened, music swelled, drums and horns that echoed off vaulted ceilings. Torin escorted her down the center aisle. Every step felt like walking into battle. Eyes tracked her movement. Whispers followed like smoke. But Alara focused on the three people waiting for her at the end of that impossibly long walk. Her son, her love, her unexpected family. They reached the platform. Torin released her arm and stepped back. Ragnar's voice filled the hall, amplified by the chamber's acoustics. We gather today to witness a union that honors tradition while forging a new path. His gaze swept the assembled crowd. 5 years ago, my son was lost. We mourned him, honored his memory, accepted his death as the price of defending this kingdom. Silence hung heavy. But Prince Darien survived. Against impossible odds, through unimaginable hardship, he endured. And when he finally returned to us, he brought proof that even in our darkest moments, hope persists. Ragnar gestured to Kael. This child represents that hope, born of love between a prince who'd lost his memory and an Omega who showed him mercy. Kael Thorn is living evidence that nobility isn't about birthright. It's about the courage to survive and the strength to love despite circumstance. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some approving, others skeptical. Ragnar raised his hand for silence. Today, we formally recognize Alara Voss as Princess Consort, not because tradition demands it, but because she has earned it through blood, sacrifice, and unwavering dedication to this family and this kingdom. He looked directly at Alara.
Do you accept this responsibility? To stand as representative of Ironridge, to uphold its values, and to serve its people with honor? Alara's mind flashed through everything that had brought her to this moment. The cabin in the wilderness, finding Darien bleeding in the ravine, raising Kael alone, walking into this fortress with nothing but truth as her weapon, fighting on those walls, tending the wounded, refusing to hide when every instinct screamed to run. She met Ragnar's eyes. I do. Then by the authority granted to me as Alpha King of Ironridge, I name you Princess Consort Alara Thorn. Ragnar lifted a silver crown, delicate, beautiful, forged specifically for this moment. May you wear this with the same courage you've shown in earning it. He placed the crown on her head. The weight was surprisingly light, but the symbolism crushed her anyway. Applause erupted, genuine from some corners, perfunctory from others. Darien stepped forward, taking her hand. You did it, he murmured. We did it, Alara corrected. Kael launched himself at both of them, wrapping his small arms around their legs. Does this mean I'm a prince for real now? It means, Darien said, scooping him up, that you're stuck with us officially. Good. Kael grinned. I like being stuck with you. The ceremony continued with formal oaths and traditional blessings. Alara spoke words that felt foreign in her mouth, promising loyalty to a kingdom that had only recently stopped seeing her as disposable. But she meant them anyway, because Ironridge wasn't just the nobles who'd opposed her or the council that had tried to silence her. It was also the soldiers who'd fought beside her, the healers who'd accepted her help, the servants who'd started looking at her with something other than contempt. It was the possibility of something better. The feast following the coronation was an exercise in diplomatic warfare. Nobles approached Alara with smiles that didn't reach their eyes, offering congratulations laced with subtle condescension. Such an unusual path to royalty, Lady Saren said, her tone dripping false sweetness. You must be overwhelmed. I've survived worse than politics, Alara replied calmly. I'll manage. Of course, though I do hope you'll accept guidance from those of us more experienced in court matters. I appreciate the offer, but I found that experience often means being comfortable with corruption. Alara smiled. I'd rather learn fresh. Seren's expression froze. She excused herself quickly. Darien appeared at Alara's elbow. Making friends already? Clarifying boundaries, Alara corrected. There's a difference. My father wants to speak with you, privately. They found Ragnar in a small council chamber reviewing documents. He looked up as they entered. Close the door. Darien obeyed. Ragnar set down his papers.
I received word from our border scouts. The Blackridge clan is regrouping, but they won't threaten us again soon. Callus survived, but his authority is shattered. That's good news, Darian said. It is, but it's not why I called you here. Ragnar looked at Alara. I want to establish a new position in the court, an advocate for those without traditional representation. Omegas, servants, frontiersmen, people whose voices are usually ignored. Alara's breath caught. You want me to fill that position. You've already been doing it, whether you realize it or not. During the siege, you worked alongside healers and soldiers without regard for rank. You fought for people, not politics. Ragnar's expression was serious. Make it official. Give those people a voice in this court. The council will fight this, Alara said immediately. Let them. You've already proven you can handle opposition. Ragnar's smile was sharp. Besides, the council answers to me. And I want this. Alara looked at Darian, who was grinning. What? This is perfect. You don't have to play politics the way they do. You get to change the rules entirely. That's terrifying. That's the point, Ragnar said. Comfort breeds stagnation. You make them uncomfortable. That's valuable. Alara thought about it. About the servants who'd bowed to her earlier, their eyes showing hope she hadn't earned yet. About the soldiers who'd fought beside her without caring about her station. About Kael, who would grow up in a kingdom that either crushed people like them or elevated them. I'll do it, she said. But I'm doing it my way. No compromises. No playing nice with nobles who think birth determines worth. I wouldn't expect anything less. Ragnar extended his hand. Welcome to real power, Princess Consort. Try not to burn the kingdom down. No promises? Alara said, taking his hand. 3 weeks later, Alara held her first open hearing. The council chamber had been rearranged, the traditional hierarchical seating replaced with a more open layout. Anyone could petition for an audience, regardless of rank. The nobles hated it. The common people flooded in. Alara sat in a chair that still felt too large, with Darian beside her and Torin standing guard. The petitioners ranged from farmers complaining about unfair taxes to Omega families seeking legal protection. She listened to each one, made notes, asked questions that cut through political doublespeak to the actual problems. When a merchant tried to dismiss an Omega's complaint about wage theft, Alara stopped him mid-sentence. You're saying she owes you labor because you provided housing? That's standard practice, Princess Consort. Standard doesn't mean legal or ethical. Alara looked at the Omega woman, young, terrified, but standing her ground. You have witnesses? The woman nodded. Then file a formal complaint. Commander Torin will investigate. Alara turned back to the merchant. And if your standard practice involves exploiting Omegas, I suggest you find a new business model. The merchant sputtered protests. Alara ignored him. The Omega woman left with tears in her eyes and hope on her face. After the hearing, Castor cornered Alara in the corridor. You're overstepping, he said without preamble. You don't have authority to order investigations without council approval. Actually, I do. The king granted me authority over matters of social welfare and labor disputes. Alara met his gaze. Would you like me to have him clarify that in writing? Castor's jaw tightened. You think you're changing things, but you're just making enemies. I've had enemies since I asked a king why my son's father was in a portrait. Alara stepped closer. The difference is now I have the power to fight back. So bring your opposition, Lord Castor. Let's see which of us the kingdom actually needs. She walked away, leaving him fuming. Darian caught up with her at the end of the hall. You really enjoy antagonizing him, don't you? It's surprisingly satisfying. He's going to retaliate. I'm counting on it. Alara's smile was sharp. The more he fights openly, the more he exposes himself. And I'm very good at surviving people who underestimate me. That night, in the privacy of their chambers, Darian pulled her close. You're terrifying, he said against her hair, in the best possible way, says the man who challenged a warlord to single combat. That was strategy. He gestured vaguely at the fortress around them. What you're doing is revolution, quiet, methodical revolution. Someone has to do it. Alara pulled back to look at him. I can't be the only Omega who gets elevated and then forget where I came from. That would make me just like them. You could never be like them. Darian's expression softened.
You care too much. Fight too hard. That's why they're afraid of you. Good. Fear means respect, eventually. How did I get so lucky? Darian wondered aloud. You bled in a ravine and I was stupid enough to help. Alara smiled. The rest was just survival. The rest, Darian corrected, kissing her forehead, was love and stubbornness and refusing to accept the world as it was. Those are basically the same thing. Exactly. Months passed. Alara's open hearings became a fixture of court life, drawing petitioners from across the kingdom. Slowly, the culture began to shift. Merchants who'd exploited Omega labor found themselves facing legal consequences. Nobles who'd abused their positions lost influence. Families who'd been ignored for generations suddenly had a voice. The council fought every change. Castor led the opposition with practiced skill, blocking legislation, delaying reforms, finding loopholes in every new policy. But Alara was patient. She'd learned survival in an environment where mistakes meant death. She could outlast politicians who'd only ever fought with words. The breakthrough came when a group of Omega workers from the southern territories marched to Ironridge, demanding better conditions. The council wanted to disperse them, send them home, pretend the protest didn't exist. Alara met them at the fortress gates instead. She stood on the walls, visible to the crowd of over 300 workers, and she spoke. I was you, she said, her voice carrying. I scrubbed floors in this fortress. I bowed to nobles who didn't see me as human. I survived on scraps and silence because that was the only way to live. The crowd quieted, listening. But survival isn't the same as living, and silence isn't the same as acceptance. Alara's hands gripped the stone parapet. You marched here because you're tired of surviving, tired of being invisible, tired of accepting that your worth is determined by birth instead of effort. She paused, letting the words sink in. I can't fix everything. I can't change centuries of tradition overnight, but I can promise you this. Her voice hardened. Your voices will be heard, your complaints will be investigated, and anyone who tries to silence you will answer to me. The crowd erupted in cheers. Inside the fortress, Castor watched from a window, his expression dark. That evening, the council convened an emergency session. She's inciting rebellion, Castor slammed his hand on the table, encouraging workers to challenge their employers, question authority. It's preventing rebellion, Lady Marin interrupted, by giving them legal recourse instead of forcing them toward violence. She's overstepping her authority. Her authority, Ragnar said quietly, comes from me, and I support every word she said. Castor turned to the king, desperation bleeding through his controlled facade. Your Majesty, this sets a dangerous precedent. If we allow Omegas to challenge nobility, then nobility will have to justify its existence through action instead of bloodline. Ragnar's voice was steel, which seems fair to me. The vote came quickly, 9-11. Narrow, but enough. Alara's position was formally expanded, her authority codified, her voice made permanent. Castor left the chamber looking like a man who'd watched his entire world crumble. 2 days later, he submitted his resignation. Ragnar accepted it without comment. The winter following Alara's first year as princess consort brought changes that would have been unthinkable 12 months earlier. Omega workers gained legal protections. Wage theft became a prosecutable crime. Educational programs opened to families regardless of station. The nobility fought every step. Some adapted, others retreated to their estates, clinging to tradition like drowning men clutching wreckage. But the kingdom moved forward anyway. Alara stood in the Hall of Valor one evening, alone, looking up at the portraits that lined the walls. Warriors and kings stared down at her, generations of thorns who'd ruled through strength and blood. And now, beside Darian's portrait, her own image stood as testament to a different kind of strength. You changed everything, you know? Alara turned to find Ragnar approaching, his hair grayer than when they'd first met, his shoulders carrying the weight of decades. I just refuse to disappear, she said. That's how revolutions start. Ragnar stood beside her, studying the portraits. My wife would have liked you. She fought the same battles, lost most of them, but she never stopped trying. What happened to her? Drowned saving a servant's child from winter floods, jumped into the river without hesitation because she saw someone who needed help.
Ragnar's voice roughened. She was a queen who ruled through compassion instead of command. The nobles hated her for it.
But you loved her. More than anything. Ragnar looked at Alara. Darien has that same capacity. To love beyond reason, beyond politics. It's what makes him strong and what makes him vulnerable. I'll protect him, Alara said quietly. I know, but he'll protect you too. That's what partnership means. Ragnar smiled. You've built something rare here, Alara. Power rooted in trust instead of fear. Hold on to that. Teach it to Kael.
Make it the foundation of whatever comes next.
What comes next? A kingdom where birth doesn't determine worth. Where omegas can stand beside alphas without apology. Where strength is measured by character instead of bloodline. Ragnar's eyes gleamed. A kingdom my wife dreamed of, that you're building. He clasped her shoulder briefly, then left her alone with the painted faces of history. Alara looked up at her portrait again, at the woman with a bow and fire in her eyes.
That woman had fought through hell to get here, and she wasn't done fighting yet. 5 years after that first question in the Hall of Valor, Alara stood in the same spot with Kael at her side. He was 9 now, tall for his age, with his father's build and his mother's stubborn determination. He wore the formal robes of a recognized heir, embroidered with silver wolves that caught the light. "Tell me again," he said, looking up at the portraits. Alara smiled. "Which part?" "The part where you asked grandfather why his son was in the painting. I didn't know he was the king. I just knew the man in the portrait was your father." Alara knelt beside Kael, bringing herself to his level. "And I decided that the truth, however dangerous, mattered more than safety." "Were you scared?" "Terrified." "But you asked anyway." "Because you deserve to know your father, and I deserve to stop hiding." Alara touched his face gently. "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak the truth when everyone expects silence." Kael nodded seriously. "Father says you changed the kingdom." "I survived it. The kingdom changed itself." "That's not what he says." Kael looked up at the portraits. "He says you proved that courage isn't about where you're born. It's about what you choose when everything's hard." Alara's throat tightened. "Your father talks too much." "He learned it from you." Laughter echoed from the hallway. Darien entered with Ragnar, both of them arguing about troop deployments with the easy familiarity of family. Darien saw Alara and Kael, and his expression softened immediately. "There you are. We've been looking everywhere." "We were just talking about history," Kael said. "The best kind of conversation." Darien ruffled his son's hair. "Ready for the council meeting?" Kael straightened. "Yes, sir." "Then let's not keep them waiting." Ragnar extended his hand to Alara. "Shall we?" Alara took it, letting the king, her father-in-law, her unexpected ally, lead her toward the council chamber. The room was full. Advisors who'd fought her elevation now worked alongside her. Nobles who'd dismissed her now sought her opinion. Omega representatives sat at the table as equals, their voices carrying weight they'd never had before. It wasn't perfect, progress never was. But it was better, and better was worth fighting for. The meeting covered trade disputes, border security, educational reform. Alara contributed where relevant, challenged where necessary, and let others lead when their expertise exceeded hers. When it ended, as the chamber emptied, Lady Marin approached. "Princess Consort, a moment?" Alara nodded, curious. Marin had become an ally over the years, but their relationship remained professional. "I wanted to thank you," Marin said quietly, "for what you've done. Not just for Omegas, but for all of us who'd forgotten what real leadership looks like." "I'm not a leader, I'm just—" "Don't." Marin's smile was genuine. "You've earned the right to accept credit. You walked into this fortress with nothing but truth and stubbornness. You survived assassination attempts, political warfare, and actual warfare. You changed laws that had stood for centuries." She paused. "That's leadership, whether you claim the title or not." Alara felt emotion swelling in her chest. "Thank you." "No, thank you, for reminding us that power without compassion is just tyranny with better armor." Marin left, leaving Alara alone in the chamber. She stood there, surrounded by maps and documents and the machinery of governance,
and let herself feel something she'd never allowed before. Pride. Not the arrogant kind, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing she'd fought for something that mattered and won. That evening, Ilara walked through the fortress gardens with Darian. Snow was falling, soft, gentle, turning the world into something clean and new. "What are you thinking about?" Darian asked, his hand warm in hers. "That 5 years ago I was terrified to speak, and now I can't seem to stop talking." Darian laughed. The council noticed. "Good. Let them be terrified for once." Ilara leaned against him. "Do you ever regret it, claiming me? The chaos it caused?" "Not even for a second." Darian stopped walking, turning to face her. "You gave me everything I'd lost. Memory, purpose, a family I didn't know I could have." His thumb brushed her cheek. "You're the reason I survived that cell. The memory of you kept me breathing when nothing else mattered." "We survived together," Ilara corrected. "You, me, Kyle, your father, even Torin and Marin, and everyone else who chose truth over tradition. Poetic way of saying we're all stubborn." "Exactly." They stood in the garden, snow falling around them, while inside the fortress their son studied strategy with his grandfather, and the kingdom they'd fought for continued evolving. It wasn't the life Ilara had imagined when she'd found a dying warrior in a ravine. It was better, because it was real. Earned. Built on choices made in impossible moments. Years later, when Kyle stood before that same portrait in the Hall of Valor preparing for his own coronation, he would remember this moment. His mother's words about courage and truth, his father's strength tempered by love, his grandfather's wisdom about power and compassion. And he would carry those lessons forward, building on the foundation they'd forged. But that was future's burden. Tonight, Ilara Voss Thorn stood in a garden with snow in her hair and her husband's arms around her, and she let herself feel something she'd never thought possible. Peace. Not because the fighting was over, it never would be, but because she'd proven something fundamental to herself and everyone watching. That survival wasn't just endurance. It was choosing, every single day, to stand up and demand better. For yourself, for your family, for everyone who'd been told they were worth less than nothing. That was legacy. Not crowns or titles or portraits on walls, but the courage to speak when silence was safer, and the strength to keep standing when everything demanded you kneel. Ilara had done both, and in doing so, she'd changed everything. Not through destiny or fate, but through choice, fought for, claimed, and finally, impossibly, earned. The snow fell heavier now, blanketing Ironridge in white. Inside the fortress, fires burned warm, families gathered, and in the Hall of Valor, portraits of warriors past stood witness to the Omega who'd refused to disappear. Her story would be told for generations, not as a fairy tale, but as proof that the world could change when someone brave enough demanded it. And that love, stubborn, defiant, unbreakable love, was the strongest force any kingdom could wield. Ilara smiled against Darian's chest, breathing in the cold night air. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new challenges, new enemies who'd underestimate her until she proved them wrong. But tonight she was exactly where she belonged, standing in the snow with the man she loved, in a kingdom they'd bled for, surrounded by a family they'd fought to protect. Not perfect, but theirs. And that was everything.